I don't know how to describe it other than like a demon type of sound.
But it's silhouetted, hulking, every bit of 5.5 feet wide, 13 to 14 foot tall, pitch black.
The one thing that ran through my mind when I had this encounter was I don't have a big enough gun.
Your host, two-time witness and field researcher for more than 40 years, William Jevning. Welcome to Creek Devil.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Bigfoot Breakdown. This week we're going to do the 1924 Mount St. Helens story as dictated by Fred Beck to his son Ronald Beck. Now we're taking this from the book that Fred Beck's son wrote, and his father Fred dictated it. There's been a lot of stuff put out about this story, and plenty of it is erroneous. So that's why I wanted to take it directly from the book. His book is called I Fought the Eight Men of Mount St. Helens, told by Fred Beck, written by R.A. Beck. I'm not going to go through the introduction, but, we're not going to talk about the entire book because a lot of what the book is about is Fred Beck's own opinions and thoughts about all this stuff, so it's not really relevant to our discussion. We wanted to break down the story. So we'll just kind of go piece by piece and, we see what sticks and what doesn't stick. So he starts out by saying in this, just chapter 1, the attack. He says, I wish first of all to give an account of the attack and tell a famous incident of July 1924, when the hairy apes attacked our cabin. Now he says they've been prospecting the area for 6 years in the Mount St. Helens and Lewis River area, southwest Washington. And he says it wasn't just a one-off incident. He says from time to time, we'd come across large tracts by creek beds and springs. And he said in 1924, I and 4 other miners, so there were 5 of them in the group, were working our gold claim, the Vander White, 2 miles east of Mount St. Helens in a deep canyon now named Ape Canyon, which was so named after the incident. So, excuse me, geez, I'm having a little issue today. There have been people saying that, the gold claim was lost. Nobody knows where it is. They don't know where the camps or the cabin site was and all that stuff. And it's nonsense. Fred Beck clearly said where it was. And on the east side of Mount St. Helens, and we talked about it with the Q&A a little bit with, my being involved in the military with Mount St. Helens eruption. But my buddies and I went there in November 1976, and I was given the location by a college student in Portland. And this was after I met John Green and Renee DeHenden in 1975. One of these students apparently talked to John Green, was writing some kind of a paper, and Green gave him my phone number, and he called me I guess he was interviewing witnesses, Bigfoot witnesses, for this paper. So we talked. And then during the conversation, he says, well, have you ever been to the Mount St. Helens site where the miners were attacked? I knew about the story from Green's book. And I said, no, we hunted elk on the west side of the mountain. I had never been to the east side. So he told me exactly how to find where the cabin had been located. The cabin burnt down in the 1960s. So, we went there and we found the spot because they had tied some small trees between trees, I guess is like, places to sit down. So it was easy to find the place. Now, the location of the cabin was on the north side of the canyon at the head of Ape Canyon on top of the Plains of Abraham. The Plains of Abraham is kind of a shelf on the eastern side of the mountain. So, when we're at the end of, the story, in his book, R.A. Beck's book, at the end is an actual, it's a photocopy of the document. This is exactly where the mine was. It's a location notice, and apparently this was filed with, I can't see whichever county it was in, or with the state, but they filed this, the Vander White claim, in August 1922, September 18th, and Marion Smith apparently was a witness. So at least I think that's how this is worded. It's not really clear, but anyhow. And on the Facebook page, the Jrdk page, I will post this particular document so people can see that. and it's from the book, so there's not a question that the mine did exist. So anyway, the one thing I guess, and I don't know what you guys think about this, but he mentions there were 5 of them, and I don't know, I'm not aware that any of the other participants were ever interviewed. When we're talking about validity of an account, we have Fred Beck's word. But have any of you ever heard of any of the other participants being interviewed?
Well, wasn't it one of the guys that actually, because they swore a pact amongst themselves, we're not going to say a peep, we're not going to say a word. And I love that part. All right, we're all sworn to secrecy on this until one of us doesn't.
Well, yeah. On their way out, they stopped at the ranger station at Spirit Lake, and I saw that ranger station when we went there in '76. And the first thing he did was tell the ranger what happened, even after they all said, "Okay, we're not going to say anything." Yeah, the pseudonym that was.
I gotta.
Go ahead, Tom.
Wasn't that Hank that did that?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I'm going to just say that President Lincoln had a similar situation. He goes, I can keep a secret. It's the others that I tell who can't.
Right. It's interesting. Now he goes on to the next paragraph and he talks about, and that's the interesting thing about picking apart these stories are the details. If it was a made up story, I mean, he'd have to be a pretty good literary composer to come up with some of these details. But he says Hank, who was kind of their leader, and that was a pseudonym, said he was a great hunter and a good woodsman, was always a little apprehensive after seeing the tracks, the footprints that they saw on creeks and springs. And that's a detail too, Tom, that we are very familiar with, with tracks around these creeks and springs.
Oh, yes. You see those tracks and your head suddenly snaps up and starts going back and forth 180 degrees in every direction.
Now, this is interesting, too. He says the tracks were large and we knew that no animal could have made them. He said the largest measured 19 inches long. Now, and there's correlation to the things like we just talked about, the springs and creeks. The 19-inch tracks. Now, I'm sure it wasn't the same creature because this was back in the 1920s when we found our line of tracks up by Spirit Lake. The night we were there that was the 10th of November of 1976. We found a line of tracks going up. I mean, there were hundreds of tracks in that line. And the best we could measure, I can't remember if we had a tape measure. We may have had one. But those tracks measured around 18, 19 inches long. I want to say they were 19. I always kind of back off a little bit thinking about slippage in that pumice, but I recollect our measurement was 19 inches. So, who knows? It may have been a descendant of the creature that he was mentioning, in this passage about having 19-inch footprints, the largest ones they found. So again, he was talking about it was the middle of July. And I can tell you plenty of things about Skamania County and that region in the middle of July. Found a lot of stuff that particular time of year. They talked about, and this is interesting too, where he said, Hank, he talked about Fred himself having a toothache and they'd gone in Hank's truck, so he couldn't go to a dentist unless Hank took him. And Hank made the comment after barely, making any note that he had a toothache. He says, Hank replied that God or the devil could not get him away from there. Interesting about the night's events that happened later, in terms of the devil or devil-like creatures, I suppose. So they talked about eating and see, now this is interesting too. Now Hank, though apprehensive, was still determined. We had been hearing, this is very interesting. He says, we had been hearing noises in the evening for about a week. We heard a shrill, peculiar whistle each evening. We could hear it coming from one ridge and then hear an answering whistling from another ridge. We also heard a sound which I could best describe as a booming, thumping sound, just like something hitting itself on its chest. The whistling, of course, we know that the creatures do from, Native American stories and legends. And we actually have a recording, Tom, of that thumping, chest thumping. very gorilla-like. Forrest, what do you think? Everybody's quiet.
Well, I think
I don't want to, Cuz.
I'm still here. I got my phone on mute because I don't want y'all to think I'm strangling cats over here. I would think that they would, they're primates, so they're gonna do primate things. Gorillas beat on their chests. I don't think it would be unheard of for Bigfoot to beat on their chests. So
I don't know if I don't know if I sent you that recording. I have a recording of that sound.
The thumping sound?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very distinctive sound with gorillas, and when you hear them do it, you readily recognize that it's chest beating.
Yeah, it's very again, it goes back to those details. There's some very interesting details that now up to this point, apparently they'd never seen one of the creatures, only the footprints, so they had no idea what the footprints were. And then to hear, well, the whistling, of course, is one thing, but this chest thumping, that's something entirely. I mean, why? If you're going to make up a story, why would you add something like that into it?
Well,
Exactly.
you wouldn't.
Yeah. Okay. So.
I mean, other people are not going to be familiar with what primates do.
No, not
and when
at all.
I say primates, yes, we're primates, but when I'm talking about primates, I'm talking about obviously humans don't go around beating on the chest. Well, let me retract that. Some people do. But,
Well, yes.
but for the most part, normal people do not do that.
No.
But gorillas do, and it's a very distinctive noise that they make. And when the silverbacks do it to each other, it's actually I don't want to say it's not actually an act of aggression, but it's like I'm the bigger guy and I can do this, and it's a
display.
It's a threatening. It's a display, but it's a threatening display in one sense. But it's not vicious or and that. But it can get that way if the other guy doesn't take heed. So. I think that it's the same thing with Bigfoot. So, and the whistles and all that, they seem to do a variety of primate things. I mean, they act like chimpanzees, they do gorilla things, and they make noises like all of them, even some of the lower order simians. So, I mean, I go back to the same old thing. They're an enigma. They're a accumulation of a lot of different things.
Clearly some of the behavior is definitely chimp and gorilla-like, while others aren't.
Every now and then you'll hear somebody say something as far as them hearing stuff in the woods that sounded like something beating its chest, but you just don't hear about it very often.
So here he goes. So here he goes on and talks about the first time they saw one. He says, Hank asked me to accompany him to the spring about 100 yards from our cabin to get some water, and suggested we take our rifles to be on the safe side, which is, good idea in those parts of the country. We walked to the spring, and then Hank yelled and raised his rifle. At that instant, I saw it. It was a hairy creature, and he was about 100 yards away on the other side of the little canyon, standing by a pine tree. It dodged behind the tree and poked its head out from the side of the tree. At the same time, Hank shot. I could see the bark fly out from the tree from each of his 3 shots. Some say that's quite a distance to see bark fly, but I saw it. Well, and he may have misjudged the distance. I mean, the rifles they had, I'm sure, were open sight rifles, so they weren't going to shoot something that they couldn't see. So if he could see where he was placing his shots, then he could have seen the bark fly also. He says, the creature I judged to have been about 7 feet tall with blackish brown hair. Now, the 2 creatures I saw when I was 16, I would have said had the same hair color. It was kind of a blackish brown color. Not out of the question. It disappeared from our view for a short time, but then we saw it running fast and upright about 200 yards down the little canyon. I shot 3 times before it disappeared from view. So apparently this was the incident that ticked these creatures off. That's something I've been told is to never shoot at one. Okay.
Well, one thing he mentions there that a lot of people mention now that's well known is how it kind of peeks around from behind the tree.
Right. It dodged behind the tree, and I'm sort of looking out to see what these guys were doing. Okay, so then he goes on, nightfall found us in our pine log cabin. The timber wouldn't have been pine. It would have been, spruce or Doug fir, one of those kinds of trees. Oh, excuse me. My throat's a little dry today, guys. All right, let me go on here. Okay, so the cabin was very sturdy. It stood for years afterwards and was visited by many sightseers. So people talk about, the cabin was lost. Nobody ever knew where it was. Well, apparently not, because they said it had many visitors over the years. So let's see. Some of the stuff just isn't real important. He says, he says a few years ago, this was in the 1960s, it burned to the ground. Circumstances of the fire, I do not recall. The cabin, we had a long bunk bed in which two could sleep feet to feet. So it was apparently long cabin. Let's see. And if you want to read this story, folks, you can go down and read, it gives a description of the cabin. And so it says after a while, they each settled down and fell asleep. About midnight, they were all awakened. Hank, who was sleeping on the floor, was yelling and kicking. But the noise that had awakened us was tremendous thud against the cabin wall. Some of the chinking, the mud they put between the logs to keep the warm air in and the cold air out, had been knocked loose from between the logs and fell across Hank's chest. He had his rifle in his hand and was waving it back and forth, and as he kicked and yelled, apparently it was quite a shock for him to be woke up this way. Says Hank always slept with his gun nearby. It was a Remington automatic, and Fred's was a 30-30 Winchester, he said, which he still has. He says, I helped get the chinking off him. It must have been a pretty good sized chunk of this mud that fell on him if he had to help get it off him. Then we heard a great commotion outside. It sounded like a great number of feet trampling and rattling over a pile of our unused shakes. We grabbed our guns. Hank squinted through the space left by the chinking. By actual count, we only saw 3 of the creatures at one time, but it sounded like there were many more. So there was no idea how big the group was. He says this was the start of the famous attack, which so much has been written in Washington and Oregon papers about throughout the years. It says most accounts of giant boulders. This is interesting too. This is one that always gets kind of misconstrued. Most accounts tell of giant boulders being hurled against the cabin, and some say even fell through the roof, but this was not quite the case. There were very few large rocks around that area, and I can attest to that. There weren't a lot of large rocks around that area, around where the cabin was. There were mostly, I would say, the biggest ones you might have found would have been basketball size, usually baseball or softball size. That was kind of the norm around there. Let's see. He says, it is true that many smaller ones were hurled at the cabin, but they did not break through the roof, but hit with a bang and rolled off. Some did fall through the chimney of the fireplace. Some accounts state that I was hit on the head by a rock and knocked unconscious. This is not true. And I know some of these documentaries and films they've made about this have definitely added things in that didn't happen. I mean, they didn't follow the story very closely. He says the only time we shot our guns that night was when the creatures were attacking the cabin. And this must have been deafening. And they're in a cabin that's probably just big enough, for these 5 guys to be in there, and they're shooting their rifles. Can you imagine the sound, what that would do to your ears?
Yeah.
Okay.
Especially over and over again.
Oh, yeah. Well, he says when they would quiet down for a few minutes, we would quit shooting. So it makes you wonder how many times they were shooting. Let's see. He says, I told the rest of the party that maybe if they saw we were only shooting when they attacked, they might realize that we were only defending ourselves. We could have had clear shots at them through the opening left by the chinking, but apparently they didn't. They didn't shoot, through the opening in the side of the cabin, which I'm not sure why they didn't, but he says, we did shoot, however, when they climbed up on our roof. We shot round after round through the roof. We had to brace the hewed log door with a long pole taken from the bunk bed. The creatures were pushing against it, and the whole door would vibrate from the impact. Tom, we've talked to people who've had very similar things happen, where they're in some kind of a structure and the creatures have tried to get in through the door at them. Okay, I guess everybody's listening. Okay, sorry, I'm trying to get by here. We responded by firing more rounds through the door. They pushed against the wall of the cabin as if trying to push the cabin over. This was pretty much impossible. As previously stated, the cabin was made very sturdy. He says, Hank and I did most of the shooting. The rest of the party crowded to the far end of the cabin, guns in their hands. Yeah, so these two guys are shooting like crazy. The other three guys are hiding in the corner of the cabin. And they seem stunned and incredulous. The attack continued the remainder of the night with only short intervals in between. It kind of reminds me of when we were at the Clark Ranch. We weren't attacked, but, it was an all-night thing. And the creatures just kept, there'd be short breaks, and then they would come back around, and then they'd leave for a bit, and then they'd come back. It was kind of a very similar kind of behavior. Thank goodness we didn't have guns and weren't shooting at them, because we didn't have a cabin.
Well, the way he talks about it, they would only do something if the Sasquatch attacked, which is why they didn't shoot out where the king had been knocked out.
Yeah, exactly. He says the most profound and frightening experience occurred when one of the creatures, being close to the cabin, reached an arm through the chinking space and seized one of our axes by the handle. And apparently this is a much written about incident and a true one. Before the thing could pull the axe out, I swiftly turned the head of the axe upright, and it was caught on the logs. And at that time, he says, Hank shot and barely missing my hand. The level of fear, you can feel the level of fear in his writing when they talk about things like that one. And you can imagine they were so frightened and excited. He grabs the axe handle so it wouldn't take the thing out, and his buddy shoots at the same time, almost hitting his hand.
You have to be terrified to have something like that happen.
Right. He said, the creature let go and I pulled the handle back and put the axe in a safe place. And then he goes on talking about, his little song he was singing about, them leaving him alone and all that kind of stuff. So, okay.
Well, you have to remember that there's other stories like the cowman story, and then the other one where the woman was out hanging up clothes. I forget where this happened. It was somewhere up in Canada, there in British Columbia, where she was hanging clothes, and the kids were playing, and they came running up to her and telling her that this thing was coming across the field, and it literally tracked across the field, and she took a sheet from the laundry and held it in front of the children because she really felt like it was coming after the children. And it came in the house and tore up the place.
It did.
And you hear stories all this time about them just wrecking havoc with places and reaching in windows. And so, that's not unusual behavior. And I don't think that those men there would have been privy to a lot of these stories because, a lot of these stories weren't even in print and available to, nationwide or even internationally. So
exactly.
How would they have known about all these stories to have created a story like that? So,
exactly right. Yeah, the details simply weren't out there. John Green was one of the first ones. Ivan Sanderson before him, but I'm trying to recall. It just was not widely disseminated information. So, especially in 1924, these stories didn't get published until the 1960s. So there really wasn't, like you said, there wasn't any knowledge of this stuff prior to that, especially in 1924. So
was that? Go ahead, guys.
oh, good. I was just gonna go ahead. I was just gonna go on with the last part of this.
Was that the story where the husband had came home and he couldn't find his family and he saw their tracks leading away from the house?
No. He was there. You're talking about the.
Okay.
Well, now there was one story. The cowman that the father was actually there, but the one that I started relating, that thing actually, the cowman story actually, the father was there and they had a long, I think like a several weeks of that thing bothering them, and they finally, he worked for a lumber yard or a lumber mill, something like that, and he actually related the story to the people at work, and then they actually, the owner, I think, or the owner's son, if I remember correctly.
It was the owner's son.
Back.
It was the owner's son because
they came back.
Yeah, the owner had two.
And he saw the house.
Yeah, the owner had two children, the son and a daughter, and a friend of mine. Because I had no way of knowing if that story was real or not until the husband of the daughter contacted me and we chatted. In fact, I think we even had him on the show once. And he said, as far as he knew, that was a real story. The brother wrote the story.
They made that into a movie called Something in the Woods you can find online.
Right.
Yeah, well, there's also the second one that I related was the one that actually occurred up in British Columbia, because I think the first one, the cowman, was somewhere in Washington or Oregon.
Copalis Beach, Washington.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was a cowman of Copalis Beach.
The second story, where the woman held the sheet up in front of the children, was the one that occurred. She I think was half
that was in
indigenous.
That was in British Columbia.
Yeah, it was in British Columbia.
That was the Ruby Creek incident.
He did. Yeah, and David was correct that the father came home and the house was completely wrecked, and that had gotten into some salmon that they had salted and broke the barrel open and ate the salmon. And he followed. He didn't know what happened to his family until he found the footprints and the tracks, and she had actually taken the children and fled down, I think a creek bottom or something, and went to a relative's house. They were all safe and sound, but they left after that. They weren't going to stick around. They left.
Okay, so let's move on.
I wouldn't either.
Yeah, let's move on and wrap this up. It says the attack ended just before daylight. Just as soon as we were sure it was light enough to come out and see, we came cautiously out of the cabin. It was not long before I saw one of the ape-like creatures standing about 80 yards away near the edge of Ape Canyon. I shot 3 times and it toppled over the cliff, down into the gorge some 400 feet below. And I can tell you it's very narrow at the head of the canyon, and it's deep and very steep. So if anything fell in there, you're not going to go down after it. It's just not going to happen. Then Hank said that we should get out of there as soon as possible and not bother our pack or supplies or equipment out. So they left everything. He said it's better to lose the equipment than our lives. We were only too glad to leave. So they left. Now we're talking 1924. They left about $200 worth of supplies. That was a lot of money back then. So, and then it goes, he goes on to finish it up by saying he tried to persuade everyone not to say anything. But Hank Suit let the cat out of the bag when he talked to the ranger at Spirit Lake. So what do you guys think? I mean, that's.
Will, correct me if I'm wrong. After that event that night, they didn't go back down there, did they?
No, they left.
Or am I wrong?
They left and never went back.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
Well, would you want to go back?
I wouldn't. You might take a pretty big group with you, well armed, maybe, but now.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I think I would have gotten the hint. Get the heck out of here.
Oh yeah.
So and stay away.
Well, now they only saw 3 at a time, but they thought there was a lot more of them. So we don't know how big that group was. It could have been pretty sizable.
Well, 3 Bigfoot at one time is a pretty.
That's enough all by itself, yeah.
Really.
Well, guys, let's go around the table. What do you think? Real or fake? David, we'll start with you.
I think it's a real case. The way they described them, even how they acted, the way they did things, I think it's legit because a lot of things you hear today, they're describing back then.
Right. Forrest, what do you think?
Oh, I think it was a real story. I've never doubted it.
And you brought up a lot of great points, especially the one where all the details of this account were simply not out there at that time. Not until 40 years later was this information put in any kind of books or printed form.
Yeah. I mean, that's just comparing it to other stories that,
Right.
that we've heard that they've done. And, so those gentlemen would not have been privy to that information. So, and there's just too much there that people encounter today. So
Yeah, too many accurate details. Chuck, what do you think?
Well, I think, there's a lot of validity with things that happened and the things that they described. But I think, if they had a pretty good gold mine there and never went back, I think that's a lot of validity to the story too, as well.
That's a great point. Yeah.
That's a true story.
Yep, I think so too. All right, folks, we're going to end it here. Like I said, if you look at Fred Beck's book, and I think there are copies available out there, it's not the greatest literary piece because he goes on into the later chapters, and it's all his.
Oh boy, does he!
Yeah, it's all his own opinion and conjecture, and it sounds pretty crazy. So we try to stick with facts of a story. We get the story and then pick it apart. And again, I will post because people said, "Oh, well, nobody was ever able to prove that the mine existed," and on and on. And in the back of his book, he actually has this location notice, and I will put that on the JRG Bigfoot Research page on Facebook when this show posts. So, with that said, thanks for joining us, everyone. Great job, guys, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Creek Devil. If you or anyone you know has had an encounter with these creatures, please contact us at williamjevning@yahoo.com. That's William, Jevning, @yahoo.com. All communication is confidential. Join us for another program next week. And until then, keep your eyes open out there.